The man they called the Butcher of Rostov didn't look like a killer. He didn't sound like one. His co-workers described him as soft-spoken, modest, even helpful. His neighbors in Shakti, a grimy coal mining town in the southern Soviet Union, saw nothing more than an aging, bespectacled man in a worn jacket who walked his dog in silence and returned to his apartment each evening like clockwork. He was no different from the thousands of ordinary citizens trudging through life under the grey, oppressive skies of the USSR. But beneath the unremarkable exterior of Andrei Romanovich, Chikatilo lurked a horror beyond comprehension. Between 1978 and 1990, he murdered over 50 people, mostly women and children, in one of the most brutal and sadistic killing sprees in modern history. He carved bodies, opened gouged eyes, out mutilated genitals, and left corpses scattered across the forests, train stations, and riverbanks of southern Russia. And for years, he got away with it. This is not just a story of a serial killer. It's a story of systemic failure, of the Soviet Union's stubborn refusal to acknowledge what was happening, of justice denied, misdirected, and finally painfully delivered. And it begins not with a murder, but with a failure to notice what the quiet teacher was becoming. Born in 1936, in the small Ukrainian village of Yabluchne, Chikatilo's life began under a shadow. His early years were shaped by starvation and violence. The Holodomor, the man-made famine orchestrated by Stalin's regime, had ravaged the land just years before. Stories of cannibalism weren't just whispered folklore, they were real, terrifying memories. Andrei's older brother Stepan allegedly disappeared during this time. Some believe he was abducted and eaten by starving neighbors. Whether true or not, this narrative haunted the family and left deep psychological scars. His father, a soldier in World War II, was captured by the Germans and returned home in disgrace, seen by many as a traitor for being taken alive. His mother, emotionally unstable and strict, ruled the household with beatings and silence. Chikatilo wet the bed until adolescence and was bullied relentlessly. He developed a deep-rooted sexual dysfunction that would shape the atrocities he later committed. He was impotent, ashamed, and obsessed with violence as a means of power. As he matured, Chikatilo became obsessed with learning. He devoured books, especially those about politics, history, and the Soviet state. He believed knowledge would elevate him, make him respectable, protect him from humiliation. He eventually earned a degree in Russian literature and became a schoolteacher. It was the perfect cover. In the classrooms of Shakti and later Novocherkassk, he was known for being strict, awkward, and occasionally strange. He often stood too close to students, touched them inappropriately, and made parents uneasy. Complaints trickled in, but in the Soviet system, where protecting the image of institutions trumped accountability, he was quietly dismissed rather than investigated. Still, no one suspected the true extent of his darkness. Chikatilo married in 1963. His wife, Feodosia, had no idea that her husband was sexually dysfunctional. They had 2 children, both conceived through medical intervention. To the outside world, they were an average Soviet family. But inside, Chikatilo was unraveling. His sexual frustration grew, and with it, the fantasies, violent, horrific, escalating. Then came 1978. In December of that year, Chikatilo lured a 9-year-old girl named Lena Zakotnova into a vacant house he had secretly purchased. He promised her candy. Once inside, he tried to undress her. When she resisted, something inside him snapped. He beat her, stabbed her, and in the frenzy found something he had never felt before: gratification. He mutilated her body and threw it into a nearby river. The police arrested a local man with intellectual disabilities. Under intense pressure, the man confessed. He was convicted and executed. Meanwhile, the real killer continued to walk free. His first taste of blood had only whetted his appetite, but for the next 3 years, Chikatilo remained dormant. Perhaps fear held him back. Perhaps he waited to see if anyone suspected him. Or perhaps, as he later claimed, he was simply waiting for the right victim. Whatever the reason, it was only a pause. The horror was far from over. In 1981, he resumed his killing spree, this time with a vengeance. Victim after victim fell to his twisted desires. The pattern was chilling: young runaways, vagrants, prostitutes, children, all lured near train stations or isolated paths, all murdered in brutal, sexualized fashion. Some were stabbed dozens of times, their eyes gouged out, their genitals mutilated. He carried a briefcase filled with rope knives and lubricant. He was methodical, precise, and entirely without empathy. The Soviet police were unequipped to deal with such a predator. Serial murder was seen as a capitalist disease, something that didn't happen in the morally superior USSR. Even uttering the phrase serial killer could bring suspicion from the KGB. As a result, cases were treated as isolated incidents, despite clear similarities. Investigators changed. Files were lost. Suspects were arrested, tortured, and in some cases, even executed. Innocent men sacrificed to protect the illusion of control. Andrei Chikatilo exploited this chaos brilliantly. He traveled frequently as part of his job with a supply firm, visiting remote towns and industrial sites. This mobility made him hard to track. He avoided direct links to his victims and chose locations carefully. His crimes were committed in woods, swamps, and along train tracks, liminal spaces, hard to surveil and easy to escape. And through it all, he returned home to his wife, his children, his job. No one looked at the balding man in the oversized coat and saw a monster. But the monster was only just beginning to roar. The early 1980s in the Soviet Union were years of stagnation. The country's leadership was aging, its bureaucracy bloated, and its people beaten down by shortages, repression, and a constant barrage of state propaganda were desperate for normalcy. Andrei Chikatilo used this desperation like a weapon. He moved in the shadows of a nation unwilling to admit that shadows even existed. After a 3-year silence following the murder of Lena Zakotnova, Chikatilo resumed his killings in 1981 with terrifying intensity. His second known victim was Larisa Tkachenko, a 17-year-old girl he lured from a bus station under the pretense of helping her find a train. Her body was found days later, mutilated and hidden in the brush. Her eyes had been gouged out. This detail, missing eyes, would become one of the most chilling hallmarks of Chikatilo's crimes. Later, he would confess that he believed his victims could carry his image in their eyes, and that by removing them, he was erasing witnesses. Whether this was superstition or delusion is unclear. What is clear is that the violence was escalating. In a country where the very concept of serial killer had no official standing, the mounting body count caused confusion, panic, and ultimately silence. The Soviet police were ill-equipped to handle a predator like Chikatilo. Crimes were logged as isolated events, never connected. Communication between regions was slow, records were incomplete, and information sharing was obstructed by politics. Admitting that a serial killer was stalking the southern provinces would have embarrassed local party officials, so they denied it. Instead, police arrested the usual suspects: homeless men, alcoholics, the mentally ill. In one instance, a man named Alexander Kravchenko was arrested for a murder that fit Chikatilo's pattern. Kravchenko had a prior conviction, making him an easy target. Despite a lack of evidence and a solid alibi, he was convicted and executed. Years later, it would be proven he had nothing to do with the crime. The real killer was still out there, watching, waiting. Between 1981 and 1984, Chikatilo claimed over 20 more lives. His hunting grounds ranged across Rostov-Novocherkassk and the Donbass region. He favored bus stations, train platforms, and forest trails. His victims were often alone, vulnerable, or ignored by society: children from broken homes, women labeled as undesirable, or travelers with no one waiting for them at home. His technique was disturbingly consistent. He would approach with a fatherly demeanor, offering food, money, or help. He carried candy for children. Sometimes he promised job leads, sometimes just a warm place to sleep. Once isolated, he would attack swiftly, usually stabbing them multiple times in a frenzy. He never used guns. He preferred blades, ropes, and his bare hands. After the act, he would arrange the bodies grotesquely, often with limbs spread or clothing pulled back as if displaying trophies. Despite the increasing number of bodies, the Soviet press remained silent. Local newspapers were forbidden from reporting on the murders under direct orders from the Communist Party. The rationale was simple: serial murder was a symptom of capitalist decay. To admit such evil existed in the USSR would undermine decades of propaganda. The truth, therefore, was buried along with the victims. But behind the scenes, a small group of investigators was beginning to suspect a pattern. In 1983, Colonel Mikhail Fetisov of the Ministry of Internal Affairs took over the Rostov region's criminal investigations. Aware that something larger was at play, he brought in a young forensic expert named Viktor Burakov. Quiet, methodical, and brilliant Burakov would become the unsung hero of the case. He immediately saw what others ignored. The killings were not random. They were methodical, ritualistic, and deeply personal. Burakov launched an unofficial investigation, one that skirted the official narrative. He collected evidence-mapped crime scenes and interviewed witnesses. He also reached out to the Soviet Union's top behavioral psychologist, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, who would later play a key role in creating one of the first criminal profiles in Soviet history. This was revolutionary. In a country where psychology was seen as pseudoscience, the idea of profiling a serial killer was radical and dangerous. But Fetisov and Burakov pushed forward knowing the cost of doing nothing was higher. Meanwhile, Chikatilo continued to kill. He became bolder, more brazen. Some victims were killed in broad daylight. Others were taken from train stations crowded with travelers. He returned to crime scenes taunting investigators. In some cases, he even joined volunteer search parties, looking for victims he had already buried. The stress began to wear on the investigators. Burakov, working grueling hours without support from his superiors, began to unravel. He developed ulcers, lost weight, and became increasingly obsessed. Colleagues whispered that he might snap, but he didn't. He kept going, driven by the faces of the victims and the knowledge that the killer was still out there. In 1984, they came close. Chikatilo was detained near a bus station after behaving suspiciously. He was found carrying a knife, a length of rope, and a jar of Vaseline tools he often used in his attacks. He was arrested and held for several days. But the lack of a centralized database, coupled with bureaucratic incompetence, meant that evidence tying him to earlier crimes wasn't available. His blood type A didn't match the semen found at the crime scenes, which was type AB. Investigators didn't yet realize Chikatilo was a rare non-secretor, meaning his blood type didn't match his other fluids. With nothing solid to hold him on, Chikatilo was released. It was a devastating blow, but there was no time for despair. More victims followed. In one of his most horrific acts, he murdered a young boy in the woods, then returned to the scene days later and decapitated the body long after police had searched the area. He used the severed head to fantasize, to revisit the thrill of the kill. This act, the severing of the head after death, became symbolic of Chikatilo's reign, calculated madness rooted in deep pathology. As the body count climbed past 30, a quiet desperation took hold among investigators. They tried everything: fake bus stops with undercover officers, widespread interviews, even polygraphs. But the killer remained just beyond their grasp, like a ghost slipping between the trees. The public, though still largely unaware, began to sense something was wrong. Rumors spread. Parents refused to let children walk alone. Some whispered of a werewolf, others of an escaped madman. But the truth was worse. The monster had a name, a job, a family, and no one could stop him. Then suddenly in 1984, the killing stopped. For 5 long years there were no bodies, no signatures, no signs. It was as if the predator had vanished. Had he died, been imprisoned, fled? The truth was stranger than anyone imagined. Andrei Chikatilo had simply decided to take a break. By the end of 1984, the name Andrei Chikatilo had been buried deep in forgotten police files, filed under no match and insufficient evidence. To most Soviet investigators, he was just one of many suspicious men questioned and discarded during the chaotic early phase of the investigation. Yet in reality, he was the storm's eye, the man behind dozens of murders, and now, inexplicably, he had gone quiet. From 1985 to 1989, there were no confirmed killings. After a spree that had claimed over 30 victims, the silence was deafening. For the team led by Viktor Burakov, the pause brought mixed emotions. There was relief, of course relief, that the bodies had stopped piling up. But also confusion. Had the killer been scared off? Had someone gotten to him? Was he lying low, or worse, had they let him slip away forever? Unbeknownst to the investigators, Chikatilo's absence wasn't the result of police pressure or guilt. It was self-imposed. In his own warped logic, he later explained that he had simply stopped killing because of the stress surrounding his 1984 arrest. He had come too close to being caught. The pressure, the interrogations, the near miss it had frightened him. Not morally, but tactically. So he paused. Not out of remorse, but out of self-preservation. During this hiatus, Chikatilo's life returned to a state of haunting normalcy. He resumed his work in procurement, traveling between Soviet factories and depots, complaining about bureaucracy, eating in canteens, and sleeping in cheap workers' hostels. At home, he played the role of father and husband. His children grew up believing their father was eccentric but harmless. His wife Feodosia noticed his long absences and odd behavior, but never suspected the true nature of his secrets. She would later claim that she had no idea what he was capable of, and perhaps tragically, she was telling the truth. But despite his silence, the shadows of his crimes lingered. In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was unraveling. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika had loosened the grip of state censorship. For the first time in decades, newspapers began reporting on social issues that had once been taboo: corruption, incompetence, and slowly crime. And that's when the rumors became headlines. Word began to spread about the unsolved murders across Rostov and its surrounding regions. Journalists, once bound by ideological loyalty, started to ask questions. Why were so many children disappearing? Why had no one been caught? And why had innocent men been executed while the real killer walked free? For the first time, public pressure began to mount. In 1987, Burakov, still haunted by the case, was permitted to reopen some of the old files. He noticed something odd. A few new murders, though, spaced far apart, bore the same gruesome trademarks: stabbing frenzy, eye removal, genital mutilation. At first, these were dismissed as isolated crimes, random acts of violence in a crumbling state. But Burakov knew better. The pattern was unmistakable, and he feared what it meant. By 1988, Chikatilo's control was beginning to slip. The need was coming back, slowly, relentlessly. In May of that year, he struck again. A 9-year-old boy named Alexei Voronko disappeared from a train station. Days later, his body was found in the woods, mutilated, partially buried, with over 20 stab wounds and eyes removed. The killer had returned. Chikatilo's reign of terror had resumed, but this time things were different. The Soviet system was no longer able to silence the story. Journalists had grown bolder, and families of victims had become more vocal. The police, burned by past failures, began to take the case seriously. And Burakov, now a seasoned investigator with connections and experience, was ready. He once again assembled a task force and began reviewing every available file. The scope was staggering. Hundreds of reports, dozens of bodies, inconsistent witness statements, and bureaucratic confusion. Yet through the noise, a pattern emerged. All the victims were either last seen near transportation hubs or discovered near train tracks. All were killed in secluded areas, but within a narrow geographic corridor reachable by rail or bus. And all bore the same grotesque signature. In late 1988, Chikatilo killed again. This time, it was a 17-year-old girl named Yelena Varga, whose mutilated body was discovered near a railway station in Shakhty, the very town where Chikatilo had once lived and taught. It was a slap in the face, a chilling message that the killer was not only back, but mocking them. It forced the hand of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. A full-scale manhunt was launched across southern Russia. Officers were assigned to patrol bus terminals, train platforms, and public parks. Undercover agents posed as drunks, vagrants, and station guards. A psychological profile was issued, the work of Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, who had built a portrait of the killer as an older man, socially awkward, sexually dysfunctional, and likely holding a job that gave him mobility. For the first time, Chikatilo was being hunted by a system that understood what he was. But Chikatilo adapted. He changed his tactics slightly, varying his kills, targeting different types of victims. He murdered both boys and girls, adults and children. He even traveled further afield to avoid suspicion. But he couldn't stop. The need was too great, the compulsion too overwhelming. In early 1989, a 16-year-old girl named Tanya Pavlenko vanished while walking home from school. Her body was found days later near a wooded trail with the same injuries. Then weeks later, a 10-year-old boy named Andrei Kravchenko was discovered dead near a railway depot, stabbed 30 times, eyes gouged, genitals mutilated. Each crime scene echoed the previous ones. Each one screamed the same silent horror. By now, Chikatilo was spiraling. The 5-year silence had only strengthened the darkness inside him. He began killing more frequently, with less caution. The intervals between murders shrank. In 1990 alone, he would kill over a dozen people, some as close as days apart. He returned to the killing fields of Rostov, to the places that had once made him feel invisible. But this time he wasn't invisible anymore. The trap was being set. Unbeknownst to Chikatilo, a new surveillance operation was launched in October 1990 around the Rostov train station, a known hotspot for his activities. Undercover officers monitored every platform, every overpass, every exit. They watched for anyone loitering, for anyone who matched the newly refined profile. And on November 6, 1990, their patience paid off. A plainclothes officer noticed a middle-aged man in a drab coat circling the station. He approached children, asked questions, watched people. He seemed out of place, nervous, twitchy. The officer approached him, asked for identification. The man's name was Andrei Chikatilo. He was detained. No evidence was found on him. Again. But this time, they didn't let him go. Andrei Chikatilo sat in the grey interrogation room of the Rostov Police Department, like a man caught in a rainstorm, soaked in tension, dishevelled, but not yet broken. It was November 1990, and after 12 years of horror, the most prolific serial killer in Soviet history was finally in custody. But the arrest was delicate. They had no physical evidence, no eyewitnesses, no weapon, no confession. They had suspicion, they had instinct, and they had Viktor Burakov, who was not about to let him slip away again. Chikatilo's behavior during his initial detention was textbook. He was calm, evasive, dismissive. He denied everything. He was merely at the station for work, he insisted. He liked to walk. He talked about literature. He feigned confusion when pressed about victims. It wasn't the first time he'd been questioned, and it showed. This was a man who had studied systems, knew how to blend in, how to deflect. His eyes, framed by thick glasses, gave nothing away. The clock was ticking. Soviet law allowed them only 10 days to hold a suspect without charges. 10 days to prove that this ordinary man with the hollow voice was the architect of some of the most gruesome murders the country had ever known. Burakov knew he needed something extraordinary. He turned to Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky. Bukhanovsky was not your average Soviet academic. A pioneer in criminal psychology, he had studied the world's most disturbed minds, not in textbooks, but in grim reality. He had profiled Chikatilo years earlier, and now he was brought into the police station not as an interrogator, but as a mirror. On November 14, 1990, Dr. Bukhanovsky entered the room where Chikatilo had remained largely silent for days. He sat down opposite the suspect, not with accusations or threats, but with empathy. He spoke softly as one human being to another. He didn't ask, "Did you kill them?" Instead he asked, "What does it feel like when the need comes?" It was a question Chikatilo didn't expect, and for the first time in years, he let his mask slip. He began to talk. What followed was one of the most disturbing confessions ever recorded. Chikatilo described the murders in gruesome detail. He didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He talked about his impotency, his humiliation, his shame, how he found sexual release not through intercourse, but through stabbing, how the act of overpowering his victims gave him a sense of control of victory. He described the moments when the killing made him feel whole. He spoke of the screams, the eyes, the blood. He remembered the names, the ages, the days of the week. He recalled how some fought, how others cried, how he returned to crime scenes to revisit his pleasure. It wasn't just a confession. It was a guided tour through madness. When Dr. Bukanovsky asked why he had started killing, Chikatilo's voice dropped into a whisper. "I was like a father," he said, "who couldn't protect his children from the war inside his head." Over the next few days, Chikatilo confessed to 56 murders. 56. Each confession was written down, corroborated, and cross-checked. Locations were revisited. Bones were uncovered. Investigators, many of whom had spent the better part of a decade chasing shadows, were stunned by the precision. He remembered how many times he had stabbed each victim, where he had left their belongings, the exact slope of the land where he had dragged a body, and yet, as he detailed his atrocities, he remained utterly detached. There was no remorse, no flicker of humanity, only calculation. Chikatilo led investigators to burial sites that had gone undiscovered for years. In some cases, he pointed out where animal activity had scattered remains. In others, he remembered the smell of the soil. He walked through woods and train yards as if giving a personal tour of his museum of death. The press was alerted quietly. This time, the Soviet state couldn't silence the story. Gorbachev's reforms had opened the floodgates, and now the Western and domestic media began circling like vultures. Headlines spoke of the Red Ripper, the Forest Phantom, and most memorably, the Rostov Ripper. The public was horrified, angry, disbelieving. How could this have gone on for so long? How had so many families been destroyed, while the killer lived among them as a teacher, a father, a colleague? For the investigators, the confession was a bittersweet triumph. After years of failures, of dead ends of innocent men executed for Chikatilo's crimes, it was validation, but not vindication. Worse still, Chikatilo knew it. He mocked the system during interrogations. He spoke of how easy it had been, how Soviet secrecy and incompetence had protected him. "You created me," he told one officer. "You turned me into a ghost." By the time the 10-day window was up, prosecutors had everything they needed. But they had a new problem. Now what to do with him? The Soviet legal system had never encountered a case of this magnitude. There were no guidelines for mass murder trials, no standard procedures for psychological defense, and worst of all, no precedent for a man who had confessed to 56 killings and showed no sign of insanity under the law. Still, the state moved forward. In April 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was formally charged with 53 murders. He pleaded not guilty to 8 of them, claiming he hadn't committed those specific killings. But for the rest, he admitted guilt. His attorneys prepared an insanity defense. Psychiatrists were summoned from across the country to determine whether he was fit to stand trial. Their conclusion: he was mentally ill but legally sane. The trial would proceed, and so began one of the most sensational courtroom dramas in Soviet history. The court of law, where Andrei Chikatilo was brought in 1992, was not equipped for a spectacle. It was a simple hall in Rostov-on-Don, used to dealing with petty crimes, workplace disputes, and the occasional murder. What it received instead was a circus of horror, grief, and national reckoning. The trial of the Rostov Ripper was not only the most notorious criminal proceeding in Soviet or now Russian history, but a macabre theatre where the country was forced to look directly into the abyss it had long denied. When the trial opened in April 1992, the Soviet Union had already ceased to exist. The red flag had fallen. The Russian Federation was a newborn state, its laws in disarray, its institutions crumbling, and its people furious. For over a decade, Chikatilo had committed his crimes, while the old regime insisted serial killers were a Western phenomenon. Now, with the truth laid bare, the public was demanding blood. From the moment Chikatilo entered the courtroom, it was clear that this would be unlike any other trial. He was placed in a cage. Literally. A large metal cage had been welded into the courtroom to house him, more to protect him from the enraged public than to restrain him. The symbolism was chilling. The beast behind bars. A man stripped of humanity. Journalists who witnessed the trial later said it felt more like a zoo exhibit than a legal proceeding. But inside that cage, Chikatilo thrived. He mocked the proceedings. He shouted at the judge. He flashed his genitals. He howled like an animal. At one point, he even claimed to be pregnant. At another, he sang old Soviet songs and recited poetry. For someone who had spent his life hiding in plain sight, the sudden spotlight seemed to awaken something grotesque inside him. His behavior oscillated between calculated defiance and unhinged performance. His outbursts were not the ravings of an insane man, though his defense insisted otherwise. Rather, they were the last desperate attempts of a predator to reclaim control, to disrupt, to manipulate. But the court was unmoved. Over the course of the trial, prosecutors laid out the horror in excruciating detail. Each of the 53 victims was discussed. Their names read aloud. Their ages, some as young as 7. The methods of murder, stabbing, strangulation, mutilation. Families sat in the gallery, many weeping openly. Others stone-faced with rage. Some had waited over a decade for justice. Others had buried multiple children, siblings, cousins, all taken by the same man. Evidence was overwhelming. Forensic matches, eyewitness accounts, Chikatilo's own confessions recorded on tape and in writing, police testimony, crime scene photographs, maps of where bodies were found, how they had been mutilated. The courtroom became a gallery of death, a parade of shattered lives. But perhaps the most haunting testimony came from Chikatilo himself. Despite his theatrics, he spoke calmly when describing the murders. He recalled the way victims pleaded, how some resisted and others simply froze. He explained how he carried the tools with him, the rope, the knife, the Vaseline. He showed little remorse, only mild irritation when questioned about inconsistencies. It was clear that to him, these were not people. They were instruments for his rage and his release. Psychiatrists were brought in to debate his mental state. The defense argued that Chikatilo was schizophrenic, that his crimes were the product of delusion. They pointed to his history, childhood trauma, sexual dysfunction, hallucinations, but the prosecution, bolstered by government psychiatrists, countered that he was not insane. Disturbed, yes. Dangerous, undeniably. But he understood what he was doing. He hid the bodies. He evaded capture. He adapted his behavior. These were the actions of a calculating, rational man, and the court agreed. The trial lasted over 6 months. 6 months of reliving nightmare after nightmare. 6 months of families watching the man who destroyed them smirk from behind steel bars. 6 months of a country asking, how did we let this happen? In October 1992, the court announced its verdict. Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders. 1 charge was dropped due to lack of evidence. The sentence, death by firing squad. As the judge read the sentence, the courtroom erupted. Families sobbed. Some cheered. Others stared blankly, the closure feeling hollow after so many years of suffering. Chikatilo remained expressionless. Then, as the guards led him away, he muttered, "I'm not guilty. I was framed. I'm a mistake of nature." It was the final insult from a man who had long abandoned his humanity. Outside the courtroom, the reaction was volcanic. The Russian public, hungry for justice in a time of political chaos and economic collapse, finally had a symbol of evil brought to account. But it didn't bring peace. How could it? The damage was too deep, too wide. Over 50 families had been torn apart. Innocent men had been executed or imprisoned during the investigation. Police had mishandled evidence, ignored patterns, and failed to protect the most vulnerable. It was not only the story of one man's descent into madness. It was a mirror reflecting the failure of an entire system. Yet there was one small measure of redemption. The case of Andrei Chikatilo forced reforms in Russian criminal law. It ushered in new procedures for inter-regional cooperation. It legitimized criminal profiling and forensic psychology. And it gave rise to a new generation of detectives, ones trained not only to react, but to understand. But justice, true justice, remained elusive. Because how do you measure justice in the shadow of so much death? You don't. You can only ensure it never happens again. When the cage door closed on Andrei Chikatilo, it didn't just lock away a killer, it locked away the embodiment of a nation's darkest denial. But even inside Novocherkask's high-security prison, where he was held on death row, Chikatilo remained an enigma. The guards called him the Professor, mocking his constant scribbling and obsession with literature. He saw himself not as a monster, but as a misunderstood intellectual, a victim of biology, of history, of the Soviet machine. In the isolation of his cell, Chikatilo took to writing. Dozens of pages. Rants, manifestos, confessions and contradictions. He wrote letters to psychiatrists, to his family, even to President Boris Yeltsin. He railed against his death sentence, called the court a farce, and insisted he was the product of a broken system, not its cause. "I am not a man," he wrote in one letter. "I am a mistake, a defect in nature, and you created me." In those words, he offered the only insight he ever truly gave. A man who had spent decades erasing human lives now sought to redefine his own, recasting himself as a byproduct of Soviet decay. The horrors of his childhood, the emotional and physical neglect, the failure of institutions, all in his view had conspired to birth the Rostov Ripper. It was not remorse, it was justification. His prison routines were eerily normal. He read Russian classics, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. He occasionally spoke with guards, mostly about politics and literature. He remained lucid, often disturbingly so. Unlike many death row inmates, he didn't collapse under guilt. He remained stable, almost detached, as if the crimes belonged to another version of himself, some forgotten entity that only emerged in the forests and train yards of the past. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the scars of his actions were far from healed. Families of victims continued to grieve in silence, many of them having never received their children's full remains. In dozens of cases, only fragments were recovered. Bones scattered by animals. Personal items dug up years after the killings. Some victims were never formally identified, their names forever missing from the official record. For the Russian public, Chikatilo became a symbol of everything that had failed them. The corrupt police, the blind courts, the arrogance of the state. He was more than a killer. He was the physical embodiment of Soviet rot. His trial had been public, yes, but his crimes had gone unseen for too long. Generations of Russians, especially those in Rostov, carried a silent burden. They had lived alongside the devil, and no one had told them. Journalists kept the story alive. True crime books began to appear. Western documentaries profiled the case, fascinated by the sheer brutality. Chikatilo's name became synonymous with evil, uttered in the same breath as Jack the Ripper and Ted Bundy. But unlike many of his Western counterparts, Chikatilo operated in near-complete silence for over a decade, enabled not by his cunning alone, but by the willful blindness of the Soviet regime. In 1993, as Russia continued to fracture politically and economically, calls for swift justice grew louder. The new Russian Federation, desperate to appear tough on crime and responsive to the public outcry, fast-tracked his execution. On February 14, 1994, after 2 years on death row, Chikatilo was taken from his cell without ceremony. There was no final meal, no last words reported. He was led into a soundproof room, forced to kneel and shot in the back of the head. The execution was carried out with cold Soviet efficiency. No photographs, no witnesses beyond the officers. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, and with that, the most infamous murderer in Russian history was gone. But the darkness he left behind wasn't buried. Years later, even as modern Russia evolved, the spectre of Chikatilo lingered. His case became a required study in law schools and criminal psychology programs. His face, once a blur in the background of state newspapers, now stared out from books and documentaries. His crimes became cautionary tales, not just about murder, but about the cost of denial, the danger of silence, and the fragility of civilization when systems fail. In Rostov, locals still speak of him in hushed tones. The forest paths where bodies were found are now avoided. Parents still warn their children not to trust strangers near train stations. The trauma, though invisible, is generational, and the question remains whispered in the minds of those who dare study the case. If he had not been caught, how many more would there have been? The disturbing truth is this: Andrei Chikatilo didn't kill because he had to. He killed because he could. Because for 12 years no one stopped him. Because the systems meant to protect the vulnerable instead protected the illusion of order. His story is not just a chapter in criminal history, it's a warning. Even the most ordinary-looking man can carry a storm behind his eyes. When the gunshot that ended Andrei Chikatilo's life echoed behind the prison walls on February 14, 1994, it closed a chapter. But it did not end the story. What remained in the wake of his execution was not relief, not peace, but a void filled with questions, trauma, and a long overdue reckoning. For Russia, just 3 years removed from the ashes of the Soviet Union, his case became a national scar, a symbol of how evil can thrive when the truth is inconvenient. The legacy of Chikatilo is complex, twisted, and far-reaching. In the immediate years following his death, the Russian public was hungry for answers. They wanted to understand how he had done it, not just how he killed, but how he evaded detection for so long. How did a man with such a clear and escalating pattern manage to move so freely across towns, cities, and provinces without being stopped? How did the state miss the signs or worse, ignore them? The answers in time revealed systemic failure on a staggering scale. The Soviet legal apparatus had been built on ideology, not practicality. Crime, especially heinous crime, was seen not as a social reality, but a political threat. Admitting the existence of a serial killer would suggest a flaw in the system, and so the system denied it could happen. Crimes were compartmentalized information hoarded, and leads dismissed if they didn't fit the party's narrative of societal perfection. Chikatilo thrived in that darkness. But in exposing this failure, his case forced change. In the aftermath of his arrest, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, one of the most powerful arms of the state, launched an internal review of investigative practices. Centralized criminal databases were expanded and digitized. Interregional cooperation between police departments, once blocked by bureaucracy and secrecy, became mandatory in violent crime investigations. Law enforcement officers were retrained to recognize patterns across cases, even when they crossed jurisdictional or ideological lines. Perhaps the most profound change came in the field of forensic psychology. Before Chikatilo, criminal profiling in the Soviet Union was virtually non-existent. Psychology itself had been marginalized, seen as a bourgeois Western tool with little scientific merit. But the work of Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky during the Chikatilo investigation changed everything. His profile, created at great personal and professional risk, had been shockingly accurate, describing the killer's psychological profile, behavioral patterns, and personal habits long before Chikatilo was caught. Following the case, the state authorized the creation of dedicated forensic psychology units within the ministry. Bukhanovsky went on to found Russia's first criminal psychology lab, training a new generation of profilers who would go on to assist in dozens of future investigations. Today, Russia's behavioral science division, although still underfunded, is modeled in part after the very work that brought the Rostov Ripper to justice. But the legacy of Chikatilo extended beyond the halls of government and academia. He infected the culture. Books, films, television specials, and documentaries sprang up in the wake of the trial. The Russian press, newly liberated from decades of censorship, dove into the case with the fervor of a nation waking from a coma. True crime authors examined every detail. Investigative journalists interviewed surviving family members, forensic experts, and even former detectives. The case became a reference point, a dark benchmark against which future crimes would be measured. Andrei Chikatilo was no longer a man. He was mythologized into a figure of absolute evil, an archetype like Jack the Ripper or Hannibal Lecter. Except he had been real. He had walked among ordinary people. He had ridden public trains, worked in schools, greeted neighbors. The horror lay not just in what he had done, but in how convincingly he had worn the mask of the mundane. In Western media, Chikatilo was often portrayed as the quintessential Soviet serial killer, shaped by famine, warped by ideology, empowered by a state too blind to see him. But for Russians, he was something more personal. He was a mirror to their society's vulnerabilities, a symptom of years spent pretending that pain could be censored and that monsters only lived elsewhere. And then there were the families. The true legacy of Chikatilo can't be measured in case files or documentaries. It lives in the silent grief of those who never received closure, in the parents who buried children in pieces, in the brothers and sisters who remember the last day they saw their sibling alive walking toward a train station. Many of them were never given a proper apology. Some never even received a confirmed cause of death. For those families, the trial didn't bring healing, only confirmation of nightmares. In the town of Shakhty, where Chikatilo once lived, people still speak of him with a kind of shuddering detachment. "We don't say his name," one resident told a reporter years later. "We say, the man from the woods," To this day, there are memorials that do not bear names, forest clearings that locals avoid, ruined sheds deep in the trees where bones were found. The geography of his crimes has become part of the local psyche, a map of grief that has no roads and no compass. And yet from that pain, something emerged. A generation of Russians, police officers, psychologists, prosecutors, grew up learning the case as a cautionary tale. It forced conversations about mental illness, about criminal profiling, about child protection. It dragged a state apparatus built on silence into the realm of reality. For all the horror Chikatilo inflicted, his capture made it harder for future monsters to hide. Still, the question lingers, was he truly unique? Or was he just the one who got caught? The fear of another Chikatilo remains, not because of superstition, but because of something far more chilling. The knowledge that evil like his doesn't look like a monster. It looks like a man in a drab coat. It speaks softly. It smiles. It waits. And sometimes it walks among us for years unnoticed. The image of Andrei Chikatilo in his final days, a thin, balding man hunched in a prison cell, scribbling manifestos and quoting Tolstoy, feels almost absurd when held against the scale of what he had done. But that contradiction is the heart of this story. Evil, in its most terrifying form, is not always loud. It doesn't always come wearing blood or rage. Sometimes it wears a briefcase, a pair of glasses, a shy smile. It stands in front of a classroom. It waits on a train platform. And it watches. What made Chikatilo so dangerous was not just what he did, but how easily he moved among us. He was not the shadowy figure of folklore or the grotesque caricature of horror films. He was forgettable, banal, a walking void. And yet, he destroyed more than 50 lives, leaving behind a trail of bodies, shattered families, and a society forced to admit that monsters don't always live in faraway stories. They live next door. Even now, decades later, his name sparks a visceral reaction. In Russia, it is uttered rarely and with contempt. It does not inspire fascination the way some serial killers do in the West. There is no romanticized image, no mystique, only disgust. Perhaps because the pain he caused was so profound, so senseless, and so long denied. But the shadow he cast continues to stretch. His crimes forced an entire nation to confront the cost of silence. His trial exposed the brutal inefficiencies of the Soviet justice system and the devastating consequences of prioritizing ideology over truth. He revealed how easy it is for evil to thrive when good people are afraid to speak or when they are convinced it's not their place. The officers who chased him lost years of their lives. Some never recovered from what they saw. Viktor Burakov, the lead investigator, suffered chronic health issues as a result of the stress and trauma. Dr. Bukhanovsky, the psychologist who broke Chikatilo's silence, would go on to counsel countless other disturbed individuals, but never again face a mind quite as warped. Both men died in the years that followed quiet heroes. Their roles often understated, their burden never fully understood. The towns and cities where Chikatilo hunted have moved on the surface. Rostov-on-Don is now a modern city with shopping malls and universities. The train stations have been renovated. The forests are less wild, more patrolled. But if you walk through certain neighborhoods, you may still find plaques on old concrete walls, memorials for lost children. You might meet older residents who still won't let their grandchildren walk home alone. In their eyes, the past isn't gone. It's just buried. Andrei Chikatilo is buried too, somewhere in an unmarked grave. The Russian state has never revealed the location, and his name is not listed on any headstone. He is a ghost with no home, no shrine, no legacy other than pain. A man who lived in the shadows and now rests in one. But for the families of his victims, there is no such rest. Their lives were split in two before and after. Birthdays became days of mourning. The sound of a train whistle, the sight of a wooded trail. These are not mundane to them. They are reminders. They are the scars that time cannot erase. There are still unanswered questions. Some investigators believe Chikatilo may have committed more murders than he confessed to. Others wonder if he had accomplices, or if there were other predators operating under the same cover of Soviet silence. Some cases remain officially unsolved, though they bear all the marks of his work. In truth, We may never know the full extent of what he did, and yet we remember. We remember because forgetting is how monsters thrive. We remember the children, the women, the runaways, the lonely and the lost those society ignored, and whom Chikatilo hunted like prey. We remember the detectives who refused to give up even as the system worked against them. We remember the families who waited years for answers. And we remember the warning: when you silence suffering, you feed it. When you deny darkness, it grows teeth. And when you let fear dictate justice, the innocent pay the price. Today, criminal investigations across the globe use what was learned from the Chikatilo case to improve profiling, forensic tracking, interagency communication, and the treatment of psychological patterns. His legacy, as grim as it is, has helped shape a world better prepared to stop the next predator before it's too late. But vigilance is not a switch that can be flipped. It is a discipline, a duty, because somewhere in some city someone is watching again. Quiet, smiling, waiting. They hope we've forgotten what happened in Rostov. We haven't. We never will.